The future has already happened, you just haven't loaded it yet. The notification glowed softly in the dark, a pulse of light demanding nothing and everything at once. She stared at it, thumb hovering, caught between the urge to swipe and the urge to disappear. It wasn't the phone that exhausted her, it was the feeling that she was always one scroll away from missing something important, one refresh away from finally catching up. One more article, one more forecast, one more voice telling her what comes next. But what if the future she was chasing had already arrived, quiet, unnoticed, embedded in the choices she'd stopped making years ago? There's a strange paradox in how we relate to time now. We live as if the present is a waiting room, a place to refresh until the real moment loads. We plan, we optimize, we future-proof. But somewhere in all that preparation, we stopped inhabiting the only timeline that actually exists, the one unfolding right now. He used to pride himself on being ahead of trends, early adopter, first to know. But lately the thrill had dulled. Every prediction felt like noise, every breakthrough, a distraction dressed as progress. One morning he closed the news tab, not out of despair, out of curiosity. What happens when you stop trying to predict the future and start observing the present with the same intensity? The shift was subtle. He began noticing patterns he'd scrolled past 1,000 times, the way his mind reached for his phone, not because he needed something, but because stillness felt like falling behind. The way every conversation had become a rehearsal for a future opinion, rather than a genuine exchange happening now. He realized he'd been living in buffering mode. Psychologists call it temporal displacement, the cognitive habit of emotionally residing in a time that isn't here yet. It's the mind's way of protecting itself from uncertainty. If I'm always planning, I'm never caught off guard. If I'm always consuming future-facing content, I'm never irrelevant. But there's a cost. When the future becomes a destination we're perpetually traveling toward, the present becomes a layover we tolerate. We stop tasting our coffee. We stop hearing the person across from us. We stop noticing the texture of our own thoughts. We become ghosts in our own timeline. She'd spent years building a life that looked perfect on paper. Strategic career moves, calculated risks, every decision reverse-engineered from an imagined outcome. And yet, sitting in the life she'd designed, she felt like a visitor. Part of her wondered if slowing down meant giving up, if presence was just another word for complacency. Maybe urgency was the only thing keeping her from drifting into irrelevance. But another part of her whispered something she'd been avoiding. What if the future she was racing toward was just the present she kept refusing to see? There's a concept in physics called block time. The idea that past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. From this view, time isn't a river we're swept along. It's a landscape we move through, but every moment is already there, waiting. The future hasn't disappeared. We've just trained ourselves not to recognize it when it arrives. He started a small experiment. For 1 week, he treated every moment as if it was the future he'd been waiting for. Not in a forced gratitude way. Just an honest question. What if this is it? The coffee in his hand. The silence before the meeting. The walk between his car and the door. What changed wasn't the events. It was his relationship to time itself. Suddenly decisions became easier, not because he had more clarity, but because he stopped needing the future to validate the present. He could make a choice without knowing where it led. He could rest without feeling like he was wasting potential. He wasn't behind. He wasn't ahead. He was exactly where time actually happens. When was the last time you truly listened to your own thoughts? Not as a problem to solve, but as a signal you were finally here. Neuroscientists at Stanford discovered something quietly profound. The brain doesn't distinguish well between imagining the future and remembering the past. Both activate the same neural networks, which means we're not actually experiencing the future when we worry or plan. We're experiencing a mental simulation running in the now. The future is always a present tense event. She stopped asking, "What should I do next?" and started asking, "What's already here that I've been too busy to notice?" The answers didn't come as revelations. They came as recognitions. The email she'd been avoiding, already written in her mind, just waiting for permission to be sent. The conversation she needed to have, already happening in the space between words. The rest she needed, already available if she stopped treating it like a luxury reserved for some distant, earned moment. The future she was postponing wasn't ahead of her. It was inside her, waiting to be allowed. There's a difference between preparing for the future and refusing the present until the future feels safe enough to enter. One is wisdom. The other is a very sophisticated form of hiding. He tried to disconnect and ended up connecting deeper. Not to more people, but to the moment itself, to the aliveness that doesn't need a caption or a plan, to the uncertainty that felt less like threat and more like invitation. In stillness, the noise inside him became readable. Maybe the future isn't something we arrive at. Maybe it's something we stop resisting. Every moment we spend waiting for conditions to align, we're standing in the very future we claimed we needed more time to reach. The question isn't, when will I be ready? The question is, what if I already am, and readiness is just another name for permission? She opened her notebook, not to capture the future, but to witness the present. She wrote without agenda, without polish, just the raw, unfiltered texture of what it felt like to be here, now, in a body, in a life, in a world that kept moving whether she documented it or not. And something unlocked. Sometimes clarity isn't found, it's allowed. The paradox of urgency is that it creates the very delay it fears. We move so fast toward the next thing that we never fully arrive anywhere. We become travelers without a destination, scrolling toward a future that keeps refreshing just out of reach. But when we stop, even for a breath, the future collapses into now. Not as loss, as arrival. What surprised me most wasn't how a simple analog journal redefined my workflow, but how it redefined what productivity meant to me. I wasn't expecting a tool to change my rhythm of thought, and honestly, I tested it more than once before I understood what actually mattered. It wasn't about capturing more, it was about inhabiting more. This isn't a recommendation, just a reflection that stayed with me. I'll leave the link below if you feel called to explore what I mean. He looked at his calendar. Every slot filled, every hour accounted for, and yet looking closer, he saw something he'd missed before. There was no block labeled now, so he added one. A single recurring event, every day, with no agenda. Just a reminder that read, "You are already in the future you were worried about last year." How does it feel? The data-driven part of him wanted to measure the impact, track the outcomes, quantify the shift. But the human part of him knew. Some things can't be optimized, they can only be lived. And maybe that's the real edge. Not knowing what's next, but being fully awake for what's here. There's a reason we feel perpetually behind. We're comparing our present to an imagined future that doesn't exist yet. We're measuring ourselves against a projection, not a reality. And projections don't tire, they don't doubt, they don't need rest. But we do. She stopped setting goals for who she'd become and started asking who she already was, underneath the plans, underneath the performance, underneath the inherited belief that presence was something she had to earn through future achievement. And she found someone she'd been ignoring for years, the version of herself that wasn't performing, wasn't producing, wasn't proving, just being. When we treat the present as a rough draft of a future final version, we miss the only edition that actually prints, this one. Right now. Imperfect, unfinished, gloriously immediate. The future is a story we tell ourselves to avoid the vulnerability of now. But now is where change happens. Now is where love exists. Now is where decisions are made, words are spoken, presence is felt. Now is the only place the future ever actually loads. He wasn't more productive after this shift. He wasn't calmer, more focused, or more aligned in any measurable way. But he stopped feeling like he was chasing something just out of frame. Somewhere between algorithms and quiet mornings, he stopped optimizing and started understanding. The notification still glowed softly in the dark, but now it was just light. Not a command, not a threat. Just one more thing happening in a present he no longer needed to escape. She looked at it, thumb hovering, and then she set the phone down, not because the future didn't matter, but because it was already here. What part of this reflection spoke to you most, and from where are you watching? Let's keep the dialogue open quietly. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.